There's a lot of intertwined issues there, and let me start with the very specific issue of climate change and the energy transformation that we know we need. We need to move to a zero carbon energy system. Excuse me. Uh, and that requires actually a lot of long-term thinking and a lot of international cooperation. So every day in the context of the Ukraine war, I'm asked by somebody, and it happened again this morning, what's the implication of the war for climate change? In other words, you see Russia cutting off or threatening to cut off natural gas to Europe, or Europe putting on sanctions on oil and gas imports from Russia. Will this accelerate the energy transition? And the answer is basically no, because uh, it may change the calculus in the very short term. It's actually opening up more coal mines again, or pumping more gas and oil to make up for uh, what has been lost from Russian supplies. Maybe by raising the price of oil and gas on world markets, it's making some new solar projects more economical and financeable. But all of that misses the main point, which is that the real changes we need are long-term strategic changes in the energy system. And that requires a stable, peaceful, cooperative environment. Even renewable energy, to be efficient and effective, needs to cross borders. It needs to be regional, even globally connected in some ways, maybe in the new hydrogen economy. We can't do this if we're in conflict. We won't do this if we're in conflict. So this is the first point, that almost everything of real value for development, and what we now call and should call sustainable development, meaning economic development that is also socially just and environmentally sustainable, requires a long perspective. If you have a short perspective because of huge uncertainties, because of war, because of conflict, then you can't accomplish anything real of the transformations that we need. You can improvise, you can maybe keep your footing in the short term, perhaps. But the truth of the matter is, real development of any kind requires years, even decades of hard, continuous work, educating children, building infrastructure, cooperating across river sheds, building power transmission grids that are, again, transnational. And that is a long-term cooperative effort that depends on peace. And we're not getting there right now, partly because our mindsets really are wrong. And unfortunately, what I have inveighed against in the US context is the idea, which is very popular, it's in every speech of US leaders, that the world is safe when the United States leads the world. So primacy, or what the political scientists call hegemony, is really built into the American thinking. I think Henry Luce did an unfortunate thing to America when he, in 1941, christened this as the American century. It was a great turn of phrase, by the way, so inspiring and so ennobling. But it actually basically went to the heads of the permanent state, that they took it literally. This is our century. In the past, it was Britain's century. In the industrial age of the 19th century, or it was the Mongol century, or it was the Roman centuries. Now it's our century. Oh, what a dangerous way to think about things, because you get way overstretched. You act provocatively without even attempting to understand the other side. And that, unfortunately, is so much of what happened in Europe after the 1990 remarkable transformation. And as you know, I was there. I was physically present in the Kremlin in December 1991. You couldn't even believe, I mean, I could not believe, and especially you'd appreciate it, a kid from Detroit sitting in the Kremlin in this huge office, and who walks in the far door? Boris Yeltsin, and he walks across the room, and he sat down right in front of me because I was leading the delegation. And he said, gentlemen, because it was all men, he said, gentlemen, in the next room is the leaders of the Soviet military. And I have just agreed with them to the dissolution of the Soviet Union. I heard literally those words.
Wow.
Yeah, wow is exactly right. It was weird.
Huge turning point.
No, so I thought, and I had been working in the Soviet Union before that. I was told, I don't know if it's true, that I was the first person to brief the Gosplan leadership in its entirety on the top floor of Gosplan, just outside of Red Square, in 1990, to the Politburo leader who headed Gosplan on the transformation to a market economy. And they were taking notes, 50 Soviet leaders on the other side, all with notebooks open, taking copious notes about market economics. But the fact of the matter is, Gorbachev and Yeltsin wanted a common home. Gorbachev, who I regard as the greatest statesman of our age, and who's reviled in Russia for having lost the Soviet Union and for inflation and everything else, he's the greatest statesman of our age because he understood that what we needed was peace rather than a cold or hot wars. And he was ready to even let the system fall rather than shoot people to, quote, save the old system. But his idea, which I know, was a common home from Rotterdam to Vladivostok, that we have a common European home. I believed it. I went to work for his team in 1991, promoting what we called the Grand Bargain, working with Graham Allison, who was then head of the Kennedy School at Harvard, and Stanley Fisher and others. And we recommended a significant financial assistance program to the Soviet Union to support its economic and political reforms. What was the White House response? Complete niet, nothing, nichevo, not anything. We're not doing this. Okay, that was a disaster for, the failure of Western support definitely undermined Gorbachev. Yeltsin emerged after the attempted putsch against Gorbachev, which was in the summer of August 1991. And then I was contacted by Yeltsin's economic leader, Yegor Gaidar, and I came to Moscow. And Yeltsin said to me and said to others, I want a normal country. I want a democratic country with the market economy, and I want normal relations with the world. I said, absolutely wonderful. This is exactly what we want. And, Gaidar, who was then the acting premier of Russia, which was about to become the sovereign country, was meeting with the G7 finance deputies in November 1991. And Russia was running out of foreign exchange reserves. This was a fulminant financial crisis. So I knew a lot about financial crises and their history and their resolution, and worked with Poland a couple of years before. And I suggested to Gaidar, well, look, tell the US and the other 6 deputy finance ministers, you need a standstill on the debt payments because you're running out of reserves. And Russia's about to become an independent country, and we can't have a financial collapse. And he came out of the meeting just absolutely ashen-faced. He said they wouldn't even consider it. They said, you have to pay to the penny. We will not allow anything right now. We're not authorized to allow anything. We will not allow anything. You continue to pay. Russia ran out of reserves at the beginning of 1992 as Yeltsin came to power. In other words, a fulminant financial crisis. I couldn't believe it. I spent 2 unbelievably frustrating years trying to get the US and the IMF to do something, and they wouldn't do anything. And Larry Eagleburger, who was acting Secretary of State, explained to me at one point, said, Mr. Sachs, it's not even about what you're advising. Even if I agreed with it, it's not going to happen. And he said, this is an election year. It's not going to happen. And the truth is, this didn't determine all the future, but God, did it show an attitude of obtuseness in the United States. And I didn't appreciate then that Cheney and Wolfowitz were working on their great neocon illusions that now we're the sole superpower, now we get to do what we want. And they really were working on the next wars because they were going to take away every Soviet ally or Russian ally in the Middle East, knock out Libya, Syria, Iraq. This was a plan already from the early 1990s, according to Wesley Smith. And I didn't know it at the time. I just couldn't believe here we are, this historic moment, a chance to cooperate. No, we're not going to cooperate. We're going to be the sole superpower. And I just found that obtuseness year after year from the U.S. And by the end of the 1990s, I basically had it because I had seen the U.S. now from all sides. I had seen it from the Latin American perspective. I had seen it from the Central European perspective. I'd seen it from the Russian perspective. I'd seen it from the Indonesian perspective in 1997. We just were not a cooperative country that aimed to work with other countries to solve problems. We were the unipolar great power of the world. We were arrogant, and we were not paying attention to what other countries said. And this manifested itself in a number of financial debacles of these countries that had big effects on the world. It also manifested in what brings us to the war in Ukraine today. Though this is a very unpopular view, it's right, and that is NATO enlargement. What John Mearsheimer has said is right. Kissinger said it, and so many other wise people. George Kennan said it in 1997. Don't do this NATO enlargement. It'll lead to a new Cold War. Now we have a hot war. The Secretary of Defense under Clinton was deciding whether to resign or not when he learned that Clinton indeed would go ahead with NATO enlargement, because Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense, said, look, we're starting to improve relations with Russia. Do we really need to risk that right now by peremptory moves of NATO enlargement, especially since unequivocally both the Germans and the Americans had promised Gorbachev and then Yeltsin no enlargement in return for German reunification. Then we lied about it. Well, it's not in writing. We brought out all our lawyers. But good historians know that those commitments were made, and we just want to deny that. And given, the predominance of U.S. government in our media, you can tell any story you want. This is absolutely true. But the long and the short of it, Rob, is that NATO enlargement started. We weren't giving any financial help. We were plotting wars against Saddam Hussein. Muammar Gaddafi, Assad, all the allies of the former Soviet Union or of the Soviet Union and then of Russia. Russia has military naval base in Syria, so Assad would be our target, and so forth. No cooperation other than superficial. And in the 1990s, the NATO enlargement started. And then during George W. Bush, well, actually, Clinton did something that, in retrospect, we didn't even see the significance of, but it was hugely significant and misguided. And that was the war against Serbia in 1999 to force Serbia to give up Kosovo. So there was a rebellion of Kosovar Albanians, or Albanian Kosovars, I should say, in Serbia. And the U.S. took sides and said, let them break away. And when Serbia said, no, they're part of Serbia, which is the normal way that diplomacy works, the U.S. bombed Belgrade for several weeks. And we set up the precedent that if you want a breakaway state or you want to weaken the other side, just go bomb them. And then when Russia says, well, when we do this, we're called the crime of humanity, but when NATO does it, that passes as defending freedom fighters. So isn't there no standard or a double standard? But just to carry on to the current day, in the early 2000s, after the Belgrade bombing, and then after 9/11, of course, Bush pushed the enlargement of NATO to, I think, 7 countries under his watch, an extraordinary increase of the number of countries. The Baltic states, to begin with, the Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, if I remember correctly, all during Bush's watch. And then to the shock of the Europeans in NATO in 2008, he said Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. And just take a look at a map. And I encourage everybody to take a look at the map of the Black Sea. What was NATO's idea? What was the U.S. strategic idea? The U.S. strategic idea was basically to own the Black Sea for NATO, because you'd have Turkey, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and where's Georgia? All the way over on the eastern side of the Black Sea suddenly is going to be a NATO country, whereas NATO was originally to defend against an invasion by a now defunct, non-existent country in Western Europe. So suddenly it is an expansionary force moving straight across the Black Sea. It reminds me a lot of the Crimean War of the 19th century. Who controls the Black Sea? And, well, one thing has led to another, and we have the war in Ukraine. And if in our media you say, the United States played a provocative war, you're immediately targeted. Oh, you're just purveying Putin's propaganda. Well, this is really nonsense. We need a serious discussion, some context, some history, and we should not have pushed NATO right up against Russia's edge and right around the encirclement of the Black Sea. But we did so, and now we're also paying consequences for this, but especially Ukraine is paying consequences for this.